It was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, who after 9/11 slashed interest rates to encourage lending. Bankers needed new participants to keep cash flowing into a system that had become a global pyramid scheme. All this newly created money entered the housing market and created unprecedented inflation. House prices rose and rose. New mothers were forced back into the workplace to service huge home loans, and the Anglo-American dream became all about land speculation.
The housing market in the West isn't about ownership. The housing market in the West, because it's the only way ordinary people can get ahead, and ordinary people can't get ahead but by wages. What we've created is a mass bubble economics around housing. As that sucks in a huge amount of capital, takes capital for genuine innovations in the economy, and puts it into a speculative use that has no genuine productive outcome.
It's interesting, if you talk to people in Germany, for example, they don't see a connection between owning a piece of property and being inclined towards being democratic. There's lots of people who rent their housing there, and they're perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. But it is true that in somewhat different contexts, both Mr. Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher pushed for more people to own housing. And actually, this is part of the problem, because if you push people to buy housing before they're ready, and if you push very dubious loans on them, and they don't understand what they get themselves into, you can have huge adverse repercussions, exactly what led to, in part, the subprime housing crisis in the United States. That's not anything to do with democracy, that's just a bad economic idea.
The breakthrough that occurred around the year 2000 in the United States was when bankers found out that the poor are honest. And they realized that if you're poor, if you're not rich, you have a different set of values. And you think that a debt is a debt, and it's something that has to be paid, and that people will try to pay the debts that they're stuck with, even if the debts are not valid, even if the debts are much more than they expected, even if they really can't pay the debts.
The lending and banking institutions, when they drew up contracts with interest rates, with flexible interest rates, I think they knew in the beginning that these problems were going to come back later on, where folks weren't going to be able to afford the mortgages as the interest rates increased. It put a lot of people in situations where they were taking food out of refrigerators, taking kids out of higher education. They're not able to afford college anymore. And it is making a really, really bad situation worse.
The banks engaged in what was a criminal conspiracy to charge more to the blacks and Hispanics. The banks got together, backed the Bush administration to block the state prosecutions of racial lending in order to exploit and charge more to the minorities.
These are loans which were made by one of the major lenders in the city and in this country, Wells Fargo, in which Wells Fargo targeted minority communities in the city, put borrowers into loans that they could not afford, put borrowers into loans that were of the subprime variety, therefore more expensive and less advantageous to the borrowers.
Hiding predatory lending practices in the small print of complex financial products was only ever going to enrich one set of interests.
Many of the communities in which African Americans live in the city were establishing momentum. There was development activity that was occurring. We were seeing signs of vitality in many of these communities, and the results of the Wells Fargo foreclosures and the subprime lending practices of that lender and others has significantly impaired that progress and brought it to a halt.
They're not worrying about, they don't come in the heart of it. Like, you in the heart of it, so you see. They don't really see the struggle if they don't come in the heart of it. They see the outside of it. That's like looking at the cover of a book and seeing the outside of a book, but if you don't go inside the book, then you'll never know what the book about. So they're not worrying about nobody else but themselves. And I think it's wrong, because if they come in the heart of it and they see it, they'll be willing to help.
What happened in Baltimore is just one example of what is happening all around the world. One way to frame this injustice is by branding it a race issue. But when we look really closely, we can see that there is something at play here that transcends race: profit.
Not an accident, for instance, that we had the deregulation in our financial industry that was such a disaster. The lobbyists of the finance industry amount to 5 per congressperson. In other words, they pay 5 people for every congressman to explain to them persuade them that they should pass legislation that is favorable to the financial industry. The poor people who are devastated don't have the money. They couldn't hire 5 per congressman. So the way our democracy works, it's an unlevel playing field.
The financial sector has acquired enormous power, partly through political contributions, so buying favors, but mostly through ideological control, convincing people that finance is good, more finance is better, and unregulated finance without limit is best. And that is really the cornerstone of this, what we call in the United States, the Wall Street-Washington corridor.
I mean, if people need any proof as to who's controlling Washington, when the bailout came after Lehman Brothers collapsed, 80% of the population was against the bailout. Notwithstanding that, Congress passed the bailout, just showing, in my view anyway, that it's really under the control of banking interests.
It's not a reflection of good democracy when a company, a group of companies, an industry, says our interests are more important than the national interest. How can that happen? Very easy. That's the role of campaign contributions, lobbying, in America's political structure. We have a flawed democracy.
This is an advanced oligarchy in the sense that its main mechanism of control, if you like, is through convincing people that you really need, for example, the 6 biggest banks in the United States in the particular form they exist today, with the very light level of regulation. And if you don't have them, if you try to change that, all kinds of awful things will happen. And this is not really blackmail. I mean, it sounds like blackmail, but they convince you it's not blackmail, it's just that's the way the world is. There's nothing you can do about it. Oh my goodness, you just have to cooperate with them. It's very clever.
The Fed is essentially the lobbyist for the commercial banking system. When you say you want to turn regulation over to the Fed, you're saying the financial sector and Wall Street should be self-regulated. And the Wall Street has veto power over whoever is going to be the head of the Federal Reserve. As long as you give veto power over the regulators to Wall Street, as long as you pick the bank regulators from the banking industry itself, you can forget any thought of calling it regulation. It's deregulation, and to call it regulation instead of deregulation is using Orwellian doublethink.